Okay, I think we might make a start then, thank you. So I'd like to just start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which we're meeting here tonight, the Yagara and Turrbal people. Pay our respects to their elders, both past, present, and those emerging, and mention that these are lands that have always been places of teaching and learning. I'd like to pay a special welcome to our guest speaker tonight, Professor Amanda Lotz. Amanda is a fellow program leader here in the DMRC. She's done some amazing work in the past around media transformation, understanding media industries, is a prolific author of many scholarly texts. And I will just say that I think we're incredibly lucky in Australia to have a presence like Amanda here, who's got, I guess, such a depth of understanding and knowledge on these systems, particularly in a moment like we're experiencing right now with regards to some pretty hectic conversations around media, their particular role in society, who pays for media. And so I think Australia itself is fortunate to have someone in the room who has got such a depth of experience, and we're certainly lucky to have someone of Amanda's calibre here at QUT. Amanda and I joined QUT around the same time, so I always feel like we're kind of, buddies, right? On this little journey together. Certainly, I'm nowhere near the high profile status that Amanda is though. So my name is Dan Angus. I'm an associate professor here at QUT. And it's so my privilege to host tonight's event. And I'm also here in a dual capacity as also a co-organiser of our Brisbane Hacks Hackers chapter. So I'm joined here tonight by some of our fellow Hacks Hackers organisers, Katie, Rosie and Simon at the front. And we're a group that meet up usually every month. COVID's made it a little bit difficult, so we've kind of been just giving ourselves a bit of a rest and organising every second month. Normally we would be organised down at the ABC in the foyer there, but COVID means that we're kind of moving around. So it's great to be here in person and to have an audience online as well joining us for this special event, which is in partnership with our colleagues at the Digital Media Research Centre here at QUT. So without further ado, I'd like to pass over to Amanda because I think everyone's interested to hear Amanda's thoughts about this particular moment in time, about how we pay for journalism and the importance of the kind of industrial transformation happening at the moment. Just before I hand over to Amanda, I'll mention that Amanda will give a presentation. We will have time for question and answer at the end, and so please think of questions as we go through, and that goes for our friends joining us online as well. I'll be moderating the questions online, so if you are joining us online, please type your questions in the Q&A, and I'll kind of verbalise them on your behalf to Amanda during that question time. But otherwise, I'll pass over to Amanda, and thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you. I can't tell you how excited I am to talk in front of real live people. It's been a while. Hopefully I'm not too rusty. Tonight's talk derives from mostly a chapter in a book that'll be out later this year from MIT Press called Media Disrupted: Surviving Pirates, Cannibals, and Streaming Wars. And that book takes a look at the way internet communication technologies disrupted the businesses of newspapers, recorded music, television, film, somewhat primarily in a US context, although this talk is not particularly US based. And I came to write that book, which is done for ideally a general audience. Hopefully MIT markets it that way. Because I had just come off of studying that transformation in television. I've been studying internet disruption of television, particularly in the US, since the early 2000s. And I realized around 2015 that I knew a lot of things that had happened, but I didn't really know the story. And so the last book I wrote tells that story, basically. Goes back and sort of figures out that thing that we thought in 2006 was a really big deal, that really didn't matter at all. Really the thing was this, blah, blah, blah. And as I finished that book, I knew that other media industries had also been disrupted, but I didn't really know enough about them to be certain of how, but my sense was that it wasn't exactly the same. And so I set out in the Big Book project to figure out what the different stories were, what were the commonalities, what would explain the discrepancies? And a lot of that was sort of out of a sense that by maybe looking at one sector and showing the diversity of stories about how internet technologies had disrupted one sector, that maybe that might help us have more sophisticated conversations about the many different ways that internet communication technologies have disrupted lots of sectors. And so in many ways, it's speaking back to more facile constructions that might talk about the internet disrupting Spotify and Uber, which these two things did disrupt different industries, but really in different ways, and we need to talk about those different ways. So that's where the talk largely comes from. As happens sometime, I had submitted a pitch to the conversation in November, and 2 weeks ago, the editor thought that the time was right. And so perhaps you saw this piece that fortunately came out just as we started to promote the event. And so this talk really is the longer version of what I tried to jam pack into 800 words there. But I do want to talk a little bit at the outset about the ways the talk and that article are going to be a bit different. The talk, first of all, is going to be a little more conversational. I'm not going to show a bunch of charts. It's not going to be particularly academic, and it's going to be more conversational. But I want you to know where I'm coming from. I didn't just sit at home and make this stuff up. I rely in my research on kind of macro level data. So like that's a chart that was in the conversation article. This is actually really helpful in telling the story about what has happened. This chart, if you look closely, shows us how much ad spending on print has declined in Australia. It's gone from 60% of the ad spend to 12% of the ad spend between the years of 2000 and 2017. And I really like this, and this is all courtesy of the ACCC. The breakout chart there that shows what online is, because one of my biggest complaints for a long time has been how many different things get thrown into online. So things like this, macro level, the money that goes in, what's happened with that? That's part of the story. Another part of the story, this didn't make the convo piece, is what has happened in terms of sales. And this is sales per population, so it's holding holding population constant. This isn't a great chart because the data source shifted, but the general curve is right on point. And this is an important part of the story because of the perception of the challenges facing newspapers being a very new phenomenon. But here we see quite clearly a strong decline between 1977 to 1996, which we can kind of call pre-digital. Notably, the decline in the US starts in the 40s there. There's no tick up there. It just goes straight down. So we're really talking about a phenomenon with a much longer history than just the digital era. But of course, we do see it going strongly downward after 2000, especially after 2011. This chart didn't make the conversation piece, but the data did. This is research drawn from the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism that was done during the 2019 UK general election. And they tracked more than 1,700 people aged 18 to 65 across their mobile and desktop devices for 6 weeks to figure out what people actually did on those devices. And what they found out was that the time spent with news was rather insignificant, right? So 3% of time on those devices was spent with news, which amounted to a whopping 16 minutes per week. So the story that I'm going to tell is based on data like that. And I stopped to make that point because I know we do have some journalists in the audience. And the story may line up exactly or maybe not so much with your personal experience, and those are important data points as well. There are bits of difference in different countries as well. I also want to state at the outset that I'm going to talk about journalism in a way that the journalists don't often talk about journalism, primarily as a business, and that doesn't mean that the other bits of it are not important. It's just a different lens. But I do want to be very clear from the outset that I am on team journalism. The reason why I'm doing this talk, why I wrote the conversation piece, is because I think, well, writing the book and seeing the story in the different industries, it was actually rather heartbreaking to look at how well, frankly, other media industries have responded to the profound digital change that internet communication technologies have provided, and then take a look at what's happened to newspapers and journalism. And one thesis that I have is that perhaps the focus has been on the wrong thing. And one of my goals in sort of talking about these businessy things and breaking journalism down to profits and revenue and things like that, it's about trying to shift the focus a little bit. And maybe if we look at the story and understand what has happened in a different way, we can actually get to the solutions that can save journalism. So I'm on the team, and you might doubt it at some point in the next hour. We'll get there together. All right. So an industrial analysis of the newspaper industry kind of begins from this statement, that the business of newspapers is about attracting and then selling attention. That's how it worked. And that's not to say that doesn't diminish in any way the various very important cultural functions that were accomplished at the same time attention was attracted and sold. It's just that in a moment of crisis as faced by this industry, we do need to go back to understand where the money came from to make that all possible. The business, for most of the 20th century, was based on what I'm going to call, and what that image is there, which hopefully everyone in this room recognizes, as the bundled newspaper. And it seems very natural and obvious. But it's important to understand that there is nothing natural or obvious about it. The bundled newspaper was an artifact of the technological conditions of the pre-internet age. Before the internet, if you wanted to share words, you had to put them on paper, and then you had to move that paper to the person that you wanted to read it. And because those were the conditions of the time, the business developed in a very particular way. Newspapers didn't put out a story every time something happened. That would make no sense, right? You have to have a bunch of stories together to make it worth the effort of putting it on the paper and taking the paper to the people. It also explains why that bundled newspaper became the norm. In order to get the economics of it all to work, you needed to attract a big audience, a mass and heterogeneous audience, people wanting different things. And that's what the bundled newspaper was. It contained a lot of different things, and it was designed that way to provide value to different audiences in different ways, and it worked. It worked quite well. What was in that bundle? I'm going to tell you some obvious things, but then I'll tell you why I'm telling you obvious things. Well, there was information in the bundle. Information, at this point, these are largely things we can ask our smart speakers or our smartphones. What is the weather? What is the sports score? Also, important things like public notices that are kind of floating around out there, and we don't really know where to put them for people to see them now. I'm scanning the room for age. All right, we'll see how this goes. Those of you who can remember life before the internet, if at 4 o'clock today you wanted to know what the weather was going to be like tomorrow, what would you do? Well, if you needed to know at exactly that moment, and maybe you were at home, you might have gone to look for the newspaper that had arrived earlier in the day, right? That's where you could find that. Otherwise, yes, you have to wait for the weather to come on the radio or the weather to come on a television news broadcast. In the small town I grew up on, I don't even know why this happened. The bank had a phone number you could call, and they would tell you the time and the temperature. Not the weather, but the temperature at least. This is super mundane, but it's really important to recognize how accessible basic information didn't used to be. And therefore, that information added a lot of value to the newspaper. Okay? So the newspaper was crucial for things that now we take for granted and can find in many places. I'm going to make a distinction now, and it's going to make some of you uncomfortable, but just bear with me. I'm going to make a distinction between news and journalism, and then I'll tell you why. News of the day, is a very thin account of things that are happening. Journalism, for our purposes just in this moment, is contextualized reporting about the news. So news might be, there was an earthquake. Journalism would be, the earthquake happened here. It is believed to have happened because this reason. its implications are, the devastation is, X, Y, and Z aid agencies are going to solve the problem, blah, blah, blah. Or, and that's the journalism. Or news is a minister has proposed, or I don't know all the Australian words. Legislation has been proposed, and that's the news. But the journalism is who proposed it, where did the idea for this come from, who's lining up against it, what is it meant to do, what is its likelihood of passing. So you get the distinction there, right? Also, trickily, sometimes journalism isn't news. We often call investigative journalism finds things and then they become news. I think that's kind of fun. Anyway, I make this distinction because internet communication technologies have affected these three things I've just talked about, information, news, and journalism, in different ways. And we need to understand that if we're going to understand what happened to the bundled newspaper and what does and doesn't work anymore. It is also very important to recognize that the bundled newspaper had a lot of other things. Comics, opinion, crosswords, obituaries, movie listings, we could go on and on. Lots of things that probably journalists didn't think of as being very important. And they weren't in terms of the things that journalism goes about doing, but they were important in terms of adding value and making the bundled newspaper a mass and heterogeneous object, desirable to a big audience. Of course, also, that bundle included ads, lots of different kinds of ads. And just as internet communication technologies affect information, news, and journalism in different ways, they also affect different parts of the ads found in newspapers in different ways, but we'll talk about that in a second. Ads were the financial lifeblood of newspapers. They were 80% of revenues in the US, 70% here in Australia, and also a valuable part of content. Again, come back in my Wayback Machine to what life was like before the internet. On a weekend, the big circular that would come that would have all of the things that are on sale at Meijer. You didn't internet shop before. You couldn't see what was in the stores without physically going there. There was value to some of those ads that we found in newspapers. They added to the value of the reader experience. As well as, and you can think about how the other bits of ads in a newspaper did so as well. So ads also were adding value to the newspaper. All right, so I've not told you anything you probably didn't already know. You also probably know this, but it's crucial. What has happened? Well, internet communication technologies have unbundled the newspaper. The internet has improved, replaced, or at least affected just about every part of the bundle, and done so in different ways. The key here, where I'm kind of going with this argument, is that it used to be that an accumulation of things added value to a newspaper. And bit by bit, the internet has stripped many of them away. And what is left is largely the most expensive part, and what is missing are all the different ways that used to pay for it. So as I continue with the talk, I'm going to probably keep using the word newspaper because that's the word that's in my brain. But I do mean in the paper and online form. And indeed, most once paper-only organizations are now hybrid. But the economic dynamics here are largely the same. The bit about being purely internet distributed really didn't change that much about the underlying economics of how this all works. But at the same time that I'm going to talk about them as being quite similar, I think we also have to acknowledge the ways in which they're different, especially the ways in which those differences matter to advertisers. Again, in the Wayback Machine, thinking about what that experience of reading a physical newspaper was like. Now, other researchers have showed how much more time we spent with a newspaper than we do spend with online news. And you think about what that behavior was. You turn the page, you're looking up and down, you're scanning, you're deciding based on what headlines, maybe I'll read that story, maybe not that. You're picking up bits, you're understanding about what's happening simply by reading a lot of those headlines. You're seeing ads, you're discounting probably most of them because maybe you don't need that product, but maybe the advertiser's getting stuck in your head. But you're spending time, and you're looking, and you're thinking, and that really is a different behavior than what we do if we read news online. There really isn't a corollary. I think the Reuters information really makes clear that people aren't going to news organizations' websites and spending a lot of time looking at different stories. When they do click through to something, they want to read the story, right? They're laser focused. We're not scanning around. We're not thinking. Well, we're thinking, but we're not looking at all the little bits around it. And that matters to advertisers because that diminishes the value of that environment for placing an ad. And again, that's where the business is based. So what happened to information? Well, apps and websites now provide a lot of that information. In most cases, it's much more detailed than what we used to get from newspapers. I have a problem with tense here. I know newspapers still exist, so I'm sort of talking about how we're in a different era in terms of the number of people that are reliant on that. That's why I use the past, I'm sorry. Also, that information is available on demand, which when you think about information, that's really how you want it. You know, I need to know the weather now. I want to know X, Y, Z now. So on-demand information delivery is pretty key. Of course, not all forms of information that used to be a core part of the newspaper have been replaced, really only those that can be commercialized. So things like the public notices, you know, there's no magic website for those that lots of people are looking at a regular basis. And if we think about the economics behind this, you know, why do these things work as businesses? How can these bits of information, you know, survive? Well, in many cases, information is pretty cheap, at least relative to things like journalism or making drama, right? So it's something like BOM. The government's got that data no matter what. You know, they might as well share it, right? So they can do that, and they provide that for free. But maybe you want, you know, a little fancier weather. Maybe you want to know weather in more places, and so therefore you go ahead and get one of those weather apps. You know, how does that business model work? Well, again, the cost of having all of that weather for the app, not that expensive, really. And a very specific advertising environment can be created. You know, what is one of the apps that's almost always up on your phone and that you probably haven't turned off your location settings for, right? You know, you really only want to know about the weather where you are. And so that has made a nice little business for many of these weather apps in terms of being able to sell location-specific advertising. So not a big cost to the content that attracts the attention. Advertisers willing to pay a premium because they can do a very certain thing with their advertising. That works. Maybe some of you have pay subscriptions for some of your sports information sites. Again, these are things that are offering often much more depth and detail than you would have had in a newspaper because you've got that fan passion, you're willing to pay for more. And it makes sense, again, because the cost of gathering that information and making it available makes the economics of it all work out. But either way, we're accessing it in ways that are mostly not related to newspaper organizations or news organizations. What happened to news? This is why we have to separate news and journalism, because different things happen. Well, news becomes ubiquitous. And that ubiquity of news in social media feeds, on websites, diminishes its commodity value, to use big words. In other words, the value that we used to get from having news in newspapers is diminished when we're encountering news in so many other places. Okay, so remember what I just talked about in terms of how we used to spend time scanning? Where do we spend time scanning now? The action is quite similar. You're processing some of it, you quickly dismiss a whole bunch of it. You might, for the most part, really only be reading headlines, but you're still learning a lot about what is going on. There's also the fact that there's other technologies in the world, and we can't forget that. This is not a digital-specific problem, right? The reason why that circulation chart trends down beginning around the 40s has to do with the fact that there are things called television and radio. And television and radio have been providing news, more so than journalism, at least in the commercial space, for a long time. It's that thin layer, not for the most part, the journalism distinction. And so the ability, the fact that any entity anywhere is putting out a lot of this news and giving us a place to feel as though we're getting that information diminishes the sense that readers have that they need to go to a newspaper to get news that they're already receiving in other places. Advertising, this is probably the key slide here tonight. And notably, nothing that I'm going to say is at all about news or journalism. Advertising dollars have shifted to better tools. So it was, in another era, that the newspaper was a really effective way to gather attention that then could be sold to advertisers. What has happened is that new technologies have emerged that do that job, at least in different ways, often better ways. So you have a technology like search. I'm looking for school shoes. I type in school shoes. Some entity has paid to be the first or second listed thing, and I may or may not click on them. They only have to pay for that ad if I do click on them. Now think about that and the value that provides to an advertiser in contrast to placing an ad, a display ad in a paper in which what percentage of the people who get the paper even are looking for school shoes, and you have no sense of whether or not there's any action there. So search is just a different thing. Search is actually a super powerful thing. It's not in that ACCC chart because it's so new, but the increased role of Amazon in search advertising spending is something that's starting to tick up very clearly in the US, and I think it certainly feels as though Amazon is trying a little harder in Australia than they had been. But think about an advertiser. I'm going to pay to be the product when somebody searches and they're in a store, right? If you're on the Amazon website, you are looking to buy the product. And that's just, it's a great advertising tool. It has nothing to do with news and journalism. It's a great advertising tool. Social media, again, where are we spending our time? Scrolling, scrolling, scrolling. This is where our attention is now. So this is where the advertisers have gone. In many cases, advertisers can pay for more specific groups than they could target otherwise. Yes, they can do the same thing on news websites, but we don't spend as much time there as news organizations wish we would. Direct messaging. How many of you receive regular emails or texts from, let's see, Anaconda at least 3 times a week? I've got to get off of that list. The internet communication tools have given marketers entirely new ways to reach us, often very affordable and very specific. And so instead of putting out those circulars to everyone every weekend, advertisers now have direct relationships with the consumers most likely to buy their products. It's a far cheaper solution for the advertiser. And if we're going to there is no equivalent of a big weekend paper online anyhow. So again, money that's gone from the industry that's not coming back. The situation of classifieds are a little bit better known, I think. Classifieds were as much as 40% of advertising revenue in the US for some papers. Classifieds are just better suited to the businesses that have emerged to connect people, whether they're looking for jobs, looking for houses, looking for cars. Those used to be pages and pages and pages of newspapers, if you can remember, right? And instead of seeing ads for a whole bunch of utes, I can specifically search that I'm in the market for a tiny little car. And that's why people have gravitated to search specific companies like cars, carsales.com, Domain, you know what they all are. So again, that's money that's not coming back into the industry. Yes, in some cases it's owned by the same companies that are in other industries, but we can't get too far into those weeds. And so none of this, as you see, has anything to do with news or journalism or its provision. The change is entirely here about advertising, and that newspapers are no longer the best way to attract attention. As is the obvious conclusion, at this point, journalism has largely become the casualty. And there's 2 core structural problems at play here, mostly that advertisers are choosing better tools. But aside from that, the value of the bundle has eroded, and that has led to that decline in subscribers. You have people choosing to vote with their feet in terms of where their willingness to continue in that economic transaction. without the value that was provided by things like information and news and lots of other things, the value proposition of the newspaper or that relationship with a news organization has just changed in ways that make it very difficult for those news organizations to continue to produce journalism, which has always been the most expensive bit. I know you know this. In the background to all of that story, we also need to acknowledge a couple other factors. The first being the corporatization of the newspapers. That's a story that's older than digitization, but it's important to that story because corporatization leads news organizations to enter digitization in a weakened state. So what do I mean by corporatization? I specifically mean the use of news organizations as investor-grade material. In other words, publicly traded stocks. That transition happened in the United States beginning in the late 1960s, a little bit through the 70s, but full force by the 80s. And so why were investors interested in newspapers in the first place? The same reason as commercial broadcasters. These industries basically just churn out cash. Like, well, obviously, doesn't everything churn out cash, Amanda? No. Advertising-based industries do. They're highly reliable. Every day, it's the same thing, in and out, more money, cash money. As opposed to, think about all the other industries that do things. They have long-term profit horizons. They have research and development periods. They have competition. They have, the product only is good for so long. All those other things. So from a corporate perspective, and when you're traded on the stock market, you're not just competing with other newspapers. You're trying to be the best way to make money, like, out there. So newspaper stocks got snapped up. And I know the story a little bit better in the US, so I'm going to kind of tell it from there. But it was not actually the buying up of newspapers, which had happened throughout the early part of the 20th century. It was the corporatization and turning them into publicly traded stocks that really changed the business. Because at that point, newspapers became beholden to regular earnings statements and trying to have to dress themselves up and make them look good every year, every quarter. And the problem is that when this happened, newspapers were a mature industry, one that's not showing continued growth. And you saw how long the circulation, at least, has been declining. So if you're not really expanding your audience, you can kind of grow by increasing your price, but mostly you reduce your cost. And so coming into the period of digitization and all of the chaos that has ensued, newspapers had actually steadily been eroding their value to readers. It might have been through a few less pages, month to month, year to year, fewer journalists on staff. Not that people noticed, but they also didn't notice, right? There was not a lot you could do. Like, the newspaper seemed to be better before. Okay. There wasn't anywhere else to go in many markets. But that underlying dissatisfaction sort of set the conditions for once technological disruption comes in. And it made readers more willing to go to these other places, and it also set the conditions for advertisers, who in many cases were facing some monopolistic conditions, at least in the US, and papers that had been steadily raising the rates for advertising, and they had nowhere else to go. So consider it, in the book I use the metaphor of the wildfire. And so you can imagine the kind of kindling that the corporatization of newspapers were before the spark of technological change. The other big broad factor here is the way in which internet communication technologies extended the competitive field. So yes, even though before internet communication technologies, newspapers may have kind of competed with television and radio. Yes, they probably lost some readers. We've got the circulation data that suggests that for sure. Newspapers, radio, television were doing kind of different things. However, with internet communication technologies, it enables them all to do video, all to do audio, all to do words, all to break news. So what was kind of a siloed environment all of a sudden becomes one competitive field. Moreover, as if there weren't enough, Internet communication technologies make transnational communication much easier. In other words, major journalism brands like the New York Times and the Guardian can circulate internationally much more easily than they could in a print era. So this too adds to the competitive space. The implications are well known. There's likely only enough scale for far fewer than used to be the case. If you do the math from that original chart, if 80% of, if the amount of money going to ads has eroded by 80%, what does that tell us? Especially if 70% of revenue comes from advertising. And it explains a shrinking field. There are certainly other options in terms of subscriber money, and that's where a lot or several publications have turned. In order to make a subscription funding, a pure subscription funding system work, you have to provide something that's not available anywhere else, right? So the news that's ubiquitous, that's not going to add the value that you need for a subscription. But within a country, again, of 25 million, how many can the market support? Sorry, I did sneak a data chart in. This is some research also from the Reuters Institute by Rasmus Nielsen and Mira Selva, based on asking people about the frequency of their news use and their interest in news. And I include this because I think it tells us something about the viability of subscription funding. So you see there, probably the people in this room largely make up that teal 17% of news lovers, extremely interested, access more than 5 times a day. But I think what's really stunning about this chart is that 48% are daily briefers. And the level of interest here of the daily briefers is significantly lower. They are at least somewhat interested. If you're somewhat interested in news, are you likely to pay for a subscription? And they're accessing at least once a day. I mean, they probably explain, in Australia, in many places, television news is reported as the most frequent source of news, and this, I think, kind of explains why that is. So, indicating not a giant market for subscription. The story is a little bit different when we start to look at the local level, and when I say local, I mean local. Whether you're in a metropolitan area or whether you're in a rural or regional area, like Kelvin Grove or the Metro North of Brisbane, right? So more specific areas. The situation here is interesting because the internet hasn't provided substitutes, for the most part, for local news. And so a distinct value proposition remains. Even pre-internet, there was probably a demand for more information, news, and journalism about one's local area than existed. Also, there aren't really substitutes. There's no question of ubiquity. It's really just news desert has, I guess, become the phrase in the United States. So there's a market both for readers and potentially for advertisers too. The advertisers that used to be in papers and are targeting a very specific community. They're local companies. The dilemma, of course, is that local doesn't scale. And that doesn't scale part is what sort of makes these things look not like good investments. Probably not investor grade, but I wouldn't rule them out in terms of whether or not they are actually commercially sustainable, or perhaps better as non-commercial enterprises. I think the other thing that we have to think about is why local papers work, or the dynamics that made local papers work in the past. And I want to acknowledge that there are a number of independent local papers out there. Many of them are continuing to do well. And that the crisis in local news is largely related to what might be called chain papers, mostly in Australia, the things that are owned by News Corp and Fairfax. And how did they make that business work? They built scale in by virtue of what they could bring to the organization on the back end, right? So the fact that they could centralize a lot of technology, business functions, HR, things like that, that helps. The other thing is that in a pre-internet era, the local paper was being heavily valued for its provision of state, national, and world news as well. And we have to be honest and recognize that now We don't need local papers to do that because for the most part, that is everywhere. So the idea isn't here, let's remake local newspapers as they've always been. And so but also a lot of those papers weren't providing a whole lot of local news content, right? So it was content that was being generated elsewhere. What about other places? The internet's everywhere, right? This surely has to be a problem in other places, and it is. If we look around comparable jurisdictions, we see that the implications of internet communication technologies on journalism in different national markets can kind of be explained relative to 4 factors. The first is the pre-existing investment in journalism. Right, so in some places, there were heavy subsidies for newspapers. In many cases, those subsidies were transferred and were also then available as newspapers began publishing online. The key thing is that in those environments, newspapers were not as corporatized, and they were not as dependent on ad funding. So if you take away the bit where the ad funding is your dominant source of money or of revenue, then the dynamics are a bit different. And you take away the corporatization piece, and you don't have a couple decades of erosion of product going into the internet crisis. And so in some places, you just have more robust, did we lose it? No, just here. More robust news cultures continuing into the internet era. Another factor is the level of investment in the national broadcaster. And I think one of the ways that we're conceptualizing this is to recognize the way that the national broadcaster can work really well as a safety net in a period of transition. And the way in which you can see that is to look at a country that has a similar reliance on advertising and doesn't have a strong national broadcaster. And so I would classify the state of the United States as it's more advanced in its news crisis. The erosion of papers at the local level has been, and the local level is the primary level, it has been more pronounced. And we've seen in the last year, let's say, what happens when you have an environment of highly partisan news provision and a lack of trust in a singular news organization. I don't have the slide, or I have the slide, but I'll show it later. Australians overwhelmingly trust public broadcasters. Across multiple measures, they are at the top of the scale. And so the fact that national broadcasters can come in and provide an environment of journalistic trust, it helps sort of fill the gaps when we see some of the traditional print news organizations failing. What else do we have here? The tolerance for government also changes things. So some countries and there's an important distinction here. We're not just talking government or public funding, we're also talking government involvement, right? So if your government is giving your news organizations more money and also telling them what to do with it, you're kind of surviving this transition better than otherwise. But then again, you've got your government involved in your news organization. And I think I was really, one of the things that I was reminded of with some of the comments to the conversation article, I was unpleasantly reminded how many people have trouble sort of separating the idea of government funding and government involvement, and that we actually have a pretty good history around the world of showing that that actually can happen, and that public funding does not necessarily have to mean government involvement. And what's always interesting, though, is the people who believe that that is the case, they fail to then ask the question about, well, what happens when you have advertisers funding your news system? And I guess and the ad involvement in that news provision must. Anyway, you know where I'm going. Finally, population. Market scale matters, right? One of the reasons why the New York Times has been able to do what it has done is because it's based in a country with 300 million people. And so, what has the New York Times done? They've switched the reliance on advertising to subscription. They have been pumping money into their newsrooms and buying more journalists. So they have been attentive to the issue of providing value in order to get those subscriber numbers. But they can do that because not only are they available at a national level say to the 17% of news lovers in the United States, but also reaching out globally and extending the brand that way. Importantly, the New York Times is not covering the State House in Michigan or the Iowa Supreme Court. And so even though it is existing as a strong national level news source and maybe could be argued as a strong state level news source in New York, it's by no means the answer to the problems in the United States as a whole. And so that issue of scale and the issue of being a country of 25 million, I think, does introduce the need to talk about subjects like diversity in some different ways. And so media diversity, which I saw is in the news again today, historically, yes, more services are better. But I'm telling you the story in which a lot of the money has gone away. And that money going away has consequences for diversity. But one idea I would pose, well, I would first say, let's take a quick look at the commercial broadcasters and see what diversity we see, even though we have three things. Are they all that different? And I'd instead pose that instead of looking at diversity in terms of number of sources, we might want to think about diversity in terms of different funding sources. Right? So the idea of maybe there's still three, but what if one's ad supported, one's government supported or public supported, and one's subscriber supported? And that is an environment in which you're more likely to see diversity in content and what is covered than merely having three commercial competitors. I promise this is the last slide. What are the solutions? I wish I had more. On some level, yes, this story is really about how the core problem here is funding. Duh. But the thing that conversations about the future of journalism or the need to start from is understanding that advertising money is the past. It's the ways in which it has left have nothing to do with the news or the journalism. It has everything to do with how you gather attention, and there being better tools for doing that now. And it's a really hard thing, because everybody who's alive now, probably mostly, can only remember advertisers footing the bill for most of the public's news and journalism. But there's nothing natural about that. I've been trying various sort of alternate reality mind games. Let's see how this one goes with you. Imagine this scenario. In the immediate post-war era, and it's time to build the roads and infrastructure of Australia, imagine that there was a technology that put ads in roads, okay? And so for decades, government did not fund the building of roads because the advertisers were like, we can do it, we will do it, and they put their ads in the roads somehow and it worked. But then sure enough, the internet comes along, and it offers these new advertising technologies, and the advertisers are like, done. Y'all can figure out your own roads. Our business is about attracting attention, and there's a better way to do it, and we're going there. Well, we'd still need the roads. We're going to have to figure out a way to pay for them, right? What would we do? I mean, well, what are the obvious options? Well, people who drive, they use the roads more. Maybe we should have them pay. We're going to use the word tax, right? We're going to have them pay more. Or basically, anything anybody needs has to be on a road at some time. So maybe we just sort of it's a blanket tax, or maybe just everything that we buy costs more now because all the shipping companies have to pay a tax to be on the roads. We'd figure this out, right? In the same way that a society needs roads, I know I'm preaching to a choir in saying something like a society cannot function, at least a democratic one, without available news, information, and journalism, without the things that don't actually show up on the bottom line. I can't show them in charts and analysis. I can't tell you how much money a government saves because a journalist does an investigative report and identifies corruption or malspending, or how much money is saved simply because government officials make decisions with the awareness that somebody might notice and that they don't engage in corrupt practices. Those things don't show up on any of the measures of the value of newspapers and journalism in society. So for the large part, subscriber funding, there's some money there. It will support some things. When I say that both subscription and public funding work best at scale, And that means that those things tend to focus on the national, especially in a country of this size. And that's great, but there's a bigger problem, and that is figuring out a mechanism to support the creation of information, news, and journalism at the local level, so that people know what's going on in their community. So people don't have to turn to Facebook pages, the irony, to know what is going on in their communities. And so that's the piece about reinventing local and community news. And that's not probably just reinventing newspapers. So the tagline here is probably not saving newspapers. I'm not trying to kill them, but the piece, the roads, right? The thing that we actually need is the thing that we have to figure out how to save. And we only have to figure out how to fund that bit. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amanda. So I'm sure there are burning questions here. I'm going to throw to the room first while our online audience type in their questions, because it is a bit longer to type a question in than it is to verbalise it here in the room. Are there any questions already that I can run a microphone up to have you pose to Amanda? Rosie.
Just jumping up from that last point about reinventing local and community news, do you think that also applies on a national level with stuff like, news that's only interesting for, the university sector, or news that's only interesting for like people involved in the arts? Like, does that is that what you're thinking of with communities as well as local?
I think so. I think anything that's providing specific value. So the student I work with, Claire, I know you're here somewhere, is focusing on specialized journalism, right? So if an organization provides such value that people are willing to pay for it because the kind of coverage isn't available elsewhere, then that is a case in which subscriber funding works, and perhaps you can scale to a national level because there are enough people willing to pay at that level. Maybe some of the ones that she's studying are actually multinational, if they're on specific interests that aren't adequately covered in other ways. And so those are communities could be an interest. I mean, it's really. It's uniting both this matter of scale and passion, right? That people are so interested in it that they desire to have something that's probably largely missing from the marketplace at this moment, that they're willing to support it.
I'll take one from the online audience if I can, Amanda.
So
there's one question which is in line with this, and feel free to add on to your previous answer. Kate asks, what are your thoughts on non-profit models? Do they work on a smaller scale? But there's another question as well, which is about this transition to public funding and whether it's happened anywhere else. So whether any of those models have kind of happened, have we got any models to kind of see?
Yep. So yes, nonprofit. Given its advanced crisis, we're seeing greater experimentation with this in the US with decent results, and a lot of it depends on other pieces of the broader structure. So the tax code in the US sort of sets things up better for philanthropic giving that helps incentivize giving to organizations. It's not to say that there aren't all kinds of potential problems, but there are problems that can be worked out in terms of you don't want people just creating organizations that then become mouthpieces for particular interests. But anyway, tax code can handle this. So definitely thinking in terms of nonprofit makes a lot of sense. I think also understanding that it's the intersection of nonprofit means that you're trying not to make that your goal isn't to make the most money, but you could have ads in a local paper and still be nonprofit. Right? Your goal is to serve the community primarily, not to conserve, trying to make the most possible money. So I think there are possibilities there. The thing I will say though, and this is the thinking outside of the box, the problem, the dilemma is finding a way to scale. And we're starting to, there's some experiments in the US with cooperatives of various forms. And the cooperative, we can imagine, I can imagine, a cooperative that works in many ways as News Corps or Fairfax have worked for a lot of those smaller papers, in that the cooperative is the back end. It's providing these quick technology solutions, maybe advertising at scale. It's not in the editorial or what we'd consider the editorial at all, but perhaps funding that kind of an infrastructure at the public level, at least to get some things up and running. And then see whether these are enterprises that can sustain themselves when they are focused only or primarily on serving their communities rather than serving investors, stockholders, and making all those numbers, and seeing what kind of money there might even be in communities that can also contribute some amount of subscriber funding and what level of local ad funding. Now, there's something there, but that's what I mean by not thinking about recreating local newspapers as they were, but really trying to pin down what's the problem here, right? The problem is we can't scale the business. And you don't need to scale the journalism, but you can scale the infrastructure. And then we just need to figure out how to pay for that, kind of like the roads.
Thanks, Amanda, first off, for a really comprehensive diagnosis of the situation.
It's code for that was a long talk.
It doesn't make for very happy thoughts, obviously, about the future of journalism. But I think just following on from that discussion, a slightly different angle on the philanthropy side, I guess that's been in my mind for a while, is what role you see, I guess, for another form of philanthropy or philanthropic trusts, I guess, in sustaining journalism. I'm thinking obviously of things like The Guardian, which, as much as I understand it, is of course in large part funded by the Scott Trust, plus subscription. In some ways, although it's not a word I would use for Jeff Bezos normally, you could call the Washington Post essentially almost a philanthropically funded organization as well. A lot of money obviously coming from Amazon funding it, and perhaps in future it could be turned into something that more resembles a trust-funded organization. And I'm kind of wondering, and part of, I guess I'm wondering, is to what extent is there a need perhaps to work towards more legislation or financial means in which more people could be encouraged perhaps to give, for instance, part of their inheritance, part of their legacy, and set up these sorts of trusts to fund journalism in that way.
Yeah. Now, I think there are many examples in many parts of the world. There's a major newspaper group in Norway, and I'm forgetting their name, that again, it's the trust, and the whole point is recognizing that the demands of attention and having the commercial model around it are really contrary in significant ways to public interest journalism. It surprises me to say these words, but there are bits and pieces of the tiny little public media system in the US that also offer some suggestion, right? The notion of being able to donate to a thing that is providing you value. Right, and I think there's a cultural layer that I've been here for 2 years, that wasn't part of the intro, that there's a cultural layer to understanding Australians' relationship to the ABC that I don't quite have yet. But I will say that my major news expenditure as an American was donating annually, constantly to my national public radio provider because I knew because they did provide all of my news, and because I believed in their mission. And so the ability to have news sources whose missions you believe in, and have a mechanism by which they can be supported is important. And so that was also incentivized in US tax law because you could deduct that from your taxes in the way that you can deduct certain things. That comes up in the digital platforms report as an idea. The ACCC says, hey, that's not a bad one. It just hasn't been acted on. So I think there are ways, and especially at a community level, I think people, and to what degree are people not paying for news because there isn't, or paying news organizations because they don't want the kind of relationship that they're being offered, or there's just not enough of value they feel to warrant that. And that doesn't mean that there's nothing of value. It's just that people vote with their feet in different ways. And I think in general, in many places, the news industry has struggled to make itself available in the ways that people can support or want to support.
I'll take one
big
more.
General statement that was probably highly problematic, and I will think of 100 reasons why that was not the right thing to say. But
I know Chris has a question, but I'll just ask from one online and then we'll go to yours, and yours will be the last one, Chris. And so there's one question here about citizen journalism, and to what extent is that just seen perhaps as an extension of professional or paid journalism, or is it somehow different, and where it might fit in these kinds of new models or this reinvention of journalism and news?
So just to check my meaning here, citizen journalism means citizens making the journalism.
Yeah, citizen, so technically usually unpaid kind of volunteer journalism.
So I'm pretty skeptical because, does anyone have a citizen doctor? This is a real profession, and so I don't have to tell anyone in this room. Like the idea that, and I think like that was the early Web 2.0 moment. Yeah, sure, you can have people edit Wikipedia pages, but that's actually not what journalism is needed. You need somebody who's and yes, there are some wonderful people who turn up week in and week out to city council meetings and report on what's happening. But very few people have the capacity in their lives to do that with the rigor that actually is needed. So I would have to go skeptical on that as a solution.
So an increasing number of journalists are writing and producing content across platforms. So you have journalists now who are getting paid, or at least have subscription models for Substack. They're also on a podcast that has a sponsorship, and maybe they also have some type of relationship with establishment newspapers and magazines, whether that's freelancing, whether they have a contract to write things periodically. Do you think there's a model in this where the funding is not the organization or the outlet itself, but is more towards the journalist who's producing across platforms and across types of audiovisual and written content?
Yeah, I'm watching that one. We'll see. I want to talk to my colleagues who've been studying YouTube for the last decade in terms of the cults of personality that those kind of systems require. Yes, I mean, like, are they inherently bad? No. But I think we do also have to understand the dynamics of them, right? In order to be a person who can make a living doing that, you probably need to have already started out somehow with some sort of name, right? So this isn't a democratizing force, likely. I think we also have to assume that a lot of that is the 17%. That's feeding the Substack, and again, like, what is the question, or what are the implications then for the rest of society if the 17% is off just reading things on Substack, following their favorite journalist? How does being a journalist change? I mean, for some, maybe it's freeing and it leads to the ability to cover all kinds of stories that hadn't really been the case. And maybe some people are doing so well that they can actually have editors involved, because editors can be really super helpful to making sure that different angles. Part of me is skeptical about Substack and how it doesn't turn into giant vanity projects, but it is early days, and so I have questions, but I reserve judgment on that one.
Yeah. We just started a Substack for Hacks Hack It. So chuck us a follow, and you can get the amazing newsletter there. No, thank you so much again. Can we all just give Professor Amanda Lotz a big hand, and thank you for what was one of the best Hacks Hackers talks, I think. Some very bare and relevant truths being told. But yeah, no, thank you so much, Amanda.
There are answers. We've just been looking in the wrong places. I really do believe that. So if you start in the very perhaps uncomfortable and odd place from, what is the business argument for this? Why could this be funded? I think there are actually lots of opportunities out there. There's really just a need to sort of pivot the conversation in some ways. Sorry.
Yep. No, so thank you again, Amanda. I will just give a plug for Hacks Hackers Brisbane. If you haven't heard of us before, if this is your first Hacks Hackers, then thank you so much for joining us. You can find out about future events on our meetup page, meetup.com. Just type in Hacks Hackers Brisbane and you'll find us, and we post upcoming events there. And so the next one, hopefully in another month and a little bit. We'll have one in March, usually towards the end of the month, but this one's a special occasion to kind of coincide with many of the members of the summer school that's been happening this week. So well done for all the summer school attendees for making it through the summer school as well. But yeah, for now, for those who are here in person, I believe we might kind of retire and find some drinks. So you're more than welcome to join us there. And if you've been online, thank you so much for joining and your questions online. And a copy of this presentation will be made available very shortly as well. So if you want to share it on your own social media accounts and kind of get the word out, that would be much appreciated as well. So yeah, thank you so much.